The morning Glen Murdoch found the briefcase, he almost walked right past it. It was sitting against the base of a spruce tree near the east edge of Confederation Park, half hidden under a low branch, the kind of thing you'd mistake for a bag of garbage if the leather hadn't caught the early light just right. Glen noticed it the way he noticed most things on his route, not because he was looking, but because after 19 years maintaining city green spaces in Ottawa, his eyes had learned to catch what didn't belong. He stopped his cart and stood there for a moment, steam rising from the coffee he'd balanced on the side rail. The park was quiet at that hour. A woman walked a retriever along the far path. A cyclist cut through without slowing. Nobody was looking for anything. Glen crouched down and looked at the briefcase without touching it. Brown leather, expensive, the kind with brasps that actually clicked, a luggage tag on the handle. He turned it to read the name and felt his heart do something strange, the way it used to when the phone rang late at night back when his son was still a teenager. The name on the tag read Victor Ashcroft. Glen wasn't a man who followed business news, but he knew that name. Everyone in the capital knew that name. Victor Ashcroft was the founder of Ashcroft Capital, the private equity firm that owned half the commercial real estate in the downtown core, and had recently been in every newspaper because of a federal infrastructure deal worth somewhere north of $3 billion. Glen had read the headline in the break room 2 weeks ago, mostly because the number had seemed unreal, $3 billion. He'd tried to make it concrete in his mind and failed. He stood up, looked around the park again, still nobody nearby. He radioed his supervisor to let her know he'd found something and was taking it to the park's office to log it. He didn't open it. He didn't even lift the flap to check if there was a phone inside or anything that might tell him more. He just picked it up by the handle, set it on the cart beside his coffee, and kept walking his route until he reached the maintenance building on Laurier. He thought about his daughter the whole way there. Mira was 26 and worked nights at a pharmacy in Canada. She was smart, had been the kind of kid who read ahead in her textbooks for fun, who asked her teachers follow-up questions that made them pause. But university hadn't been an option, not with Glen on one income after her mother left, and not with the years that followed, the lean ones, the kind where you choose between a winter coat and a dentist appointment, and spend 3 days pretending it isn't a choice at all. Mira had never complained. That was the part that stayed with Glen longest, long after she'd moved out and found her footing. She had never once made him feel like he'd failed her, but he knew. He logged the briefcase at the park's office, filled out the found property form, and called the non-emergency line to report it the way procedure required. The dispatcher told him to hold it at the office and that someone would be in touch. Glen made himself a second coffee and sat at the picnic table outside with the bag on the bench beside him. He hadn't been tempted. That wasn't quite the right word for what he felt. It was more like an awareness, the way you're aware of a car driving too fast on a residential street. He knew what was probably in the bag. He knew it could change things, and he had looked at that possibility the same way he looked at the speeding car. Not with desire, but with a kind of tired recognition that some things in this world moved fast and careless, and the best you could do was not get in the way. The call came 2 hours later. A woman who introduced herself as Lorraine, assistant to Victor Ashcroft, asked him to confirm the tag name and the location where the briefcase had been found. She was polite in the way that people who spend all day being polite become polite, efficient, pleasant, nothing wasted. She told Glen that Mr. Ashcroft would be sending someone to collect the item and that they appreciated his diligence. Glen said sure, no problem, anytime. The courier arrived 40 minutes later, young man in a black jacket, no uniform but carrying himself like someone on a schedule. He signed the property release form, thanked Glen with a nod that managed to mean nothing, and left. Glen watched him pull out of the parking lot and thought, that's that, he was wrong. 3 days passed. Glen worked his roots, raked out the winter-damaged turf near the splash pad on Olmsted, replaced 2 signs that had been knocked loose in the March wind. He ate his lunches at the same picnic table, listened to the radio in the cart, called Mira on Thursday evening the way he did every week. He didn't mention the briefcase. There hadn't seemed to be anything worth mentioning. On Friday afternoon, his supervisor Harriet stuck her head out of the maintenance building and told him someone was asking for him up at the front. The man standing in the small waiting area was not a courier. He was in his early 60s, shorter than Glen had expected from the photographs. Glen realized only then that he had been imagining him tall, wearing a wool coat the color of charcoal and holding his own hat in one hand like someone who had been raised to take his hat off indoors. His hair was gray and cut close. His face had the particular kind of weathered calm that you see sometimes on men who have been through things and come out the other side with fewer words and more patience. Victor Ashcroft extended his hand and Glen shook it. "Mr. Murdoch," he said. "I hope I'm not pulling you away from something." "Glen's fine," Glen said. "And no, We were just finishing up. They stood in the small room with its corkboard full of safety notices and its folding chairs and its smell of damp workwear and engine oil, and Victor Ashcroft looked around at it with an expression that was not condescension. Glen watched him for that and didn't find it. What he found instead was something more like recognition, a man who had been in rooms like this before or rooms that had felt like this. "I wanted to come personally," Ashcroft said. "Lorraine told me about the call and I wanted to. I had some things I wanted to say that didn't feel right to send through someone else." Glen said, "You didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to." Ashcroft paused. "May I tell you what was in the bag?" Glen nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd asked. "There was a laptop," Ashcroft said. "Encrypted, but our IT team would have trouble recovering the data if it had been compromised. There were documents, copies, but specific enough to be sensitive, and there was a letter." He stopped. "A personal letter. From my son." Glen waited. "Ellie passed away 4 years ago," Ashcroft said. "He was 31. There was an accident on the highway near Kingston. January, black ice. He was coming home for the weekend." He said this without performance, the way you say something you have said many times before but still haven't finished meaning. "The letter was one he'd written me but never sent. His wife found it in his desk about a year after and gave it to me. I've been carrying it ever since." He cleared his throat. "In the briefcase, which I know is not rational." "It's rational," Glen said. Ashcroft looked at him. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I suppose it is." There was a brief quiet between them, the kind that isn't uncomfortable. "I want to thank you," Ashcroft said. "Properly. I have people who would have arranged something, a check, a gift card, whatever the appropriate amount is supposed to be for this kind of thing. But I didn't want that. I wanted to ask you what you actually need." Glen felt something shift in his chest, not dramatically, more like a floorboard settling. He had been prepared, he realized, to be thanked in the efficient way, the nod, the envelope, the transaction completed. He had not been prepared for this. "You don't have to do anything," Glen said. "Honestly, I did what anyone should do." "I know," Ashcroft said. "That's exactly why I'm here." Glen looked out the small window at the park, at the grass still pale from the winter, a pair of geese working their way across the far end. He thought about Mira again, the way he always thought about Mira when something surprised him into honesty. "My daughter," he said, and then stopped, because he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence without it sounding like a request which he didn't want it to be. "Tell me about her," Ashcroft said, so Glen did. He told him about Mira's marks in high school, the science fair project she'd built in their kitchen, using a borrowed circuit board and a library book, the way her teachers had called her methodical, which Glen had always thought was their polite way of saying she worked harder than the other kids because she had to. He told him about the pharmacy job and the night shifts, and the way Mira had started taking online courses 2 years ago in healthcare administration, paying for them one at a time because that was all she could manage. He told him that she was good, not just competent but genuinely good at what she wanted to do, and that she didn't complain, and that this was the thing he couldn't quite put down, that she had never once made it his problem, even though it was. He ran out of words eventually and felt slightly embarrassed. Ashcroft had listened without interrupting. He did not look like a man calculating figures. He looked like a man who had learned at some cost how to hear what someone was telling him. "Is she in Ottawa?" he asked. "Canada," Glen said. Ashcroft nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and produced a card, not a business card, a plain white card with a phone number and an email address written by. He set it on the counter between them. "I'm not going to make you any promises today," he said, "but I'd like to speak with her, not as a favor to you, or not only that. I run a foundation. We fund continuing education for people in healthcare who can't access institutional support. It's small, we're still building it, but we have 2 positions open for administrative fellows, paid, with tuition." He paused. "It's not charity. We need people who are good at what they do. If she is what you say she is, I'd like to meet her." Glen looked at the card. He didn't pick it up yet. "She's proud," he said. "She won't want anyone to think she got something because of me." "She won't," Ashcroft said. "She'll have to apply like anyone else. I'll tell her I heard about the program through whatever reason makes sense. You can decide that part." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a father who worked a job like this, maintenance at the Université de Montréal for 31 years. He never asked anyone for anything either. He said it without sentiment, just as information. It's a kind of pride, I understand, and a kind of pride that costs things." Glen picked up the card. He held it for a moment, thinking about all the conversations he hadn't had with Mira. Not because he was hiding things from her, but because some truths you carry alone, not to protect yourself, but to protect the people who would feel guilty if they knew. He thought about the winter he'd eaten oatmeal for dinner 4 nights a week so she could have the protein. He thought about the school trip to Quebec City he'd told her he couldn't afford while paying for in secret by selling the guitar he'd had since before she was born. He thought she never knew. And then he thought that was the whole point. "I'll talk to her," Glen said. He didn't say anything to Mira that night. He sat with the card on his kitchen table and turned it over in his fingers and looked out his apartment window at the darkness over the park. He had a habit of doing this, sitting with things before speaking them, that Mira used to tease him about when she was a teenager. "You think so loud," she used to say. "The whole block can hear you." He called her on Saturday morning instead of Thursday. She picked up on the third ring, voice still carrying that particular flatness of someone 2 hours off a night shift. He asked her how she was. She said fine, tired, she'd had a rough Friday. He asked about the courses. She said the healthcare law module was harder than she'd expected, but she was keeping up. He said, "I heard about something, a fellowship program, healthcare administration, I think you should look at it." There was a pause. "Where'd you hear about that?" "Someone mentioned it," he said. "I wrote down the contact. It's a foundation, they do continuing education funding. Paid position, they cover tuition too, I think." Another pause. "Dad, are you trying to—" "I'm not trying to do anything," he said. "I'm passing along information, you can do with it whatever you want." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the particular quality of her silence, not suspicion exactly but assessment. She had always been careful about things that seemed too good. He had never decided if that was wisdom or something sadder than wisdom. "Send me the contact," she said finally. "I will, okay." A beat. "How are you?" "Good," he said. "Cold still." "But good, you need a better coat." "I have a coat." "You have a coat from 2014, she said. "That's not the same thing." He laughed. It surprised him, the ease of it. "I'll get a new one. I'll believe it when I see it," she said, and he could hear her smiling, and the morning felt lighter than it had in a while. Mira applied. She didn't tell Glen she was doing it, and he didn't ask. He had sent her the contact and then made himself leave it alone, which was its own kind of discipline. He went back to his roots, fixed the broken slat on the bench near the reflecting pool, planted the early annuals in the beds near the war memorial alongside 2 of the seasonal staff. March became April and the ice went out of the Rideau and the geese returned in numbers and the city came back to life the way it always did, slightly dazed and grateful. He didn't hear from Ashcroft's foundation. He didn't expect to. He had done what he could and put it in Mira's hands, and Mira was capable. He had always known she was capable. The call came on a Tuesday late afternoon while Glen was washing out the cart in the maintenance yard. His phone buzzed in his vest pocket and he pulled it out with wet hands and almost didn't answer because he didn't recognize the number. "Dad," Mira said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in a long time. Not happiness exactly, something more startled than happiness, something that hadn't settled into itself yet. "They called me," she said. "The foundation. I had an interview last week. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to. I just didn't want to get your hopes up in Caira. They offered me a position," she said, "full-time. Starts in June. It covers—" She stopped. He could hear her breath catch. "Dad, it covers everything. The salary's more than I make now and they cover the rest of the degree and theirs." She stopped again. "There's a mentorship component, real people in the field, like actual administrators at actual hospitals." Glen sat down on the step outside the maintenance door. The yard smelled like cut grass and diesel. A sparrow landed on the fence 3 feet away and considered him. "That's good," he said. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. "I don't." She paused. "Did you know this would happen?" "I hoped," he said, "but no, how did you even find out about this program?" He thought about the briefcase. The spruce tree, the early morning light catching the brass clasp, the luggage tag with the name he recognized, the letter a dead man had written to his father and never sent. "Long story," he said. "I'll tell you sometime. Tell me now." "Later," he said. "When I can do it properly." She accepted this the way she had always accepted his pacing, with patience she had probably learned from him, or maybe always had, he was never entirely sure. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I want you to know that, not because of this, before this. I've always been, I just want you to know that." The sparrow flew off, the yard was quiet. "I know, Dad," Mira said, and then softer, "I know." He saw Ashcroft once more 2 months later by accident. Glen was on his lunch break, sitting on the bench near the Mackenzie King Bridge with a sandwich and a thermos, watching the river. A man sat down at the other end of the bench and Glen looked over and recognized him immediately. The charcoal coat was gone, replaced by a lighter jacket, but the close gray hair and the particular stillness were unmistakable. Ashcroft glanced over and recognized him at the same moment. Something passed across his face, not surprise but a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as though he had been expecting this without knowing it. "Mr. Murdoch," he said. Glen said. Ashcroft sat back and looked at the river. "How is she?" "Starts in 3 weeks," Glen said. "She's nervous. She won't admit it, but I can tell. Good nervous or bad nervous." Considered this. "The kind you get when something is real," he said, "when it actually matters." Ashcroft nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Ellie used to get that, he said. Before anything important, he'd go very still. His mother always knew before I did. Glen didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to a thing is just to let it be said. She interviewed well, Ashcroft said. I want you to know that. Whatever you think, she got that position because of what she knew and how she thought. My people don't do me favors they'll regret. I know, Glen said. She wouldn't have wanted it any other way, neither would I. They sat for a while longer, two men on a bench above a river in a city just coming fully into spring, eating their lunches separately and in something that was not quite silence. The water was running high and fast with the snowmelt from up north, brown and cold and purposeful. After a while Ashcroft stood, put his hat back on. He was wearing a hat today, a plain gray one, and nodded. Thank you, he said simply, the way you say something you have already said but mean differently now that time has passed. Thank you, Glen said back. And that was all. Ashcroft walked east along the river path and Glen finished his coffee and went back to work, back to the grass and the soil and the trees coming into bud, back to the ordinary and essential labor of keeping something alive, and he thought, not for the first time, that there are days when nothing extraordinary happens, and days when something small tips into something large, and that the only way to be ready for the second kind is to show up faithfully for the first. He had shown up. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it.